The laughter started before the auctioneer even finished reading the property description. A ruined estate on the edge of Fairview County. 11 abandoned cars. 2 decaying airplanes. Unpaid taxes. Structural damage. Years of neglect. And somehow, the final winning bid belonged to a single father who drove a 15-year-old pickup truck and worked 6 days a week fixing other people's engines. Several investors exchanged amused looks. One man in an expensive blazer actually shook his head. That mechanic just bought himself a disaster. Ethan Walker heard every word. He signed the paperwork anyway. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. He simply folded the documents, thanked the clerk, and walked toward the parking lot where his faded blue pickup truck waited beneath a row of American flags outside the county administration building. The truck's passenger seat was filled with grocery bags and a science project his 12-year-old daughter had forgotten at school. Responsibility came first. It always did. The estate sat nearly 20 miles outside town, beyond an old church parking lot and several miles of winding country roads. By the time Ethan arrived, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the property. The main house stood weathered and silent behind overgrown trees. Rusted classic cars sat scattered across cracked pavement. 2 neglected airplanes rested near a collapsing hangar like forgotten relics from another era. Most people saw junk. Most people saw risk. Ethan stood quietly studying details. His eyes moved from the hangar roof to drainage patterns in the soil, from the aircraft frames to markings nearly hidden beneath decades of dust. He noticed things quickly, the kind of things other people overlooked. A county worker watching nearby frowned. "You know this place is probably worth less than what you paid for it." Ethan smiled politely. "Maybe." The man waited for more. None came. As evening approached, Ethan unlocked the front door for the first time. Inside, sunlight filtered through broken shutters. Dust drifted through the air. A row of old mailboxes stood against one wall, each marked with dates from decades ago. Most buyers would have started calculating demolition costs. Ethan crouched beside a damaged staircase and examined the wood grain instead. Then he pulled a small notebook from his jacket and began writing observations. Measurements, serial numbers, structural notes. The list grew quickly. Outside, his phone buzzed. A message from his daughter asking whether he would still make it to her school band concert. Ethan checked the time. He had work to do. The estate needed attention. Money was tight. The utility bill waiting at home was already overdue. Yet 10 minutes later, he locked the house, climbed back into his pickup truck, and headed toward town. The concert mattered more. Later that night, after the performance ended, Ethan stopped at a small diner with his daughter for pie and hot chocolate. She talked excitedly about school, while he quietly reviewed estate records between bites. One faded document caught his attention. It referenced maintenance logs stored somewhere on the property. Logs that should not have existed anymore. Ethan stared at the page for several seconds. Something did not fit. Something about the airplanes. Something about the history of the estate. Across the diner, a television mounted above the counter played a business interview with Charlotte Hayes, CEO of Hayes Aeronautics, one of the largest aviation companies in the region. Ethan barely noticed, but fate had already begun moving pieces into place. Because hidden somewhere inside the ruined estate was a secret almost everyone had missed. And before long, it would force powerful people to look at Ethan Walker very differently. The next morning began before sunrise. Ethan Walker parked his pickup truck behind Miller's Auto Repair and unlocked the service bay while most of Fairview was still asleep. The smell of motor oil and cold metal filled the air. A stack of invoices waited on the counter beside a red utility bill marked past due. Ethan glanced at it once before sliding it beneath a repair manual. There would be time to worry later. Right now, there were customers depending on him. By 7 o'clock, he was diagnosing an electrical problem on a delivery van that 2 other mechanics had failed to solve. He listened more than he talked. Measured, tested, observed. Within 20 minutes, the engine came to life. His coworkers exchanged surprised looks. Ethan simply cleaned his tools and moved on to the next job. He never explained how he knew where to look. During lunch, while others sat around a picnic table behind the garage, Ethan remained in the corner reviewing copies of the estate records he had found. Most pages contained property tax information and maintenance reports. But one detail continued bothering him. The aircraft serial numbers listed in the old documents did not match the numbers he had seen painted on the planes. The discrepancy was small, easy to overlook, yet stayed in his mind. Later that afternoon, he stopped at a grocery store to buy bread, milk, and his daughter's favorite cereal. As he loaded bags into the truck, he noticed an elderly man struggling to change a flat tire. Without hesitation, Ethan set down his own groceries and helped. The man tried offering money. Ethan declined politely and wished him a safe drive home. By the time Ethan reached the estate again, the sun was beginning to set behind the trees. He spent the next 2 hours clearing debris from the hangar entrance. Most people would have hired equipment. Ethan could not afford that. He worked carefully, saving anything that looked useful. Beneath a pile of damaged crates, he uncovered a rusted metal cabinet filled with maintenance ledgers. Dust covered every inch. Many pages were ruined, but some survived. Ethan carried the box into the main house and began sorting through them beneath the light of a portable work lamp. The more he read, the stranger the records became. Certain repairs had been documented with extraordinary precision. Aircraft inspections, custom modifications, specialized engineering notes. This was not the work of an ordinary estate owner. Someone with advanced technical knowledge had operated here decades ago. Ethan copied several references into his notebook. Then he noticed something else. A page had been deliberately removed from one of the ledgers. Not torn by age, removed intentionally. The missing section appeared to connect multiple entries spanning several years. Before he could study further, his phone rang. It was his daughter calling from home. Her science competition permission form was due the next morning, and she was worried about the registration fee. Ethan looked around the dark, crumbling estate. Money was already tighter than ever. Yet his answer came immediately. Do not worry about it. We will figure it out. After the call ended, he returned to the ledger. Tucked between 2 pages was a faded photograph of one of the airplanes when it was brand new. On the back, someone had written a single sentence. Not everything valuable was meant to fly. Ethan stared at the words for a long moment. Then he slowly looked toward the dark hangar outside. For the first time, he began to suspect the estate might be hiding something far more important than old cars and forgotten airplanes. Ethan Walker spent most of Saturday morning inside the estate's collapsing hangar, comparing maintenance ledgers against the serial numbers he had copied into his notebook. The deeper he looked, the less sense the records made. Certain aircraft components listed in the documents did not belong to the planes parked outside. Others referenced equipment that was nowhere on the property. It was as if someone had deliberately hidden part of the story. A cool wind drifted through broken windows as Ethan carefully brushed dirt from an old metal identification plate mounted inside one aircraft. The number beneath the dust matched neither the county records nor the registration documents. He frowned and wrote it down. Hidden beneath years of neglect, something important was beginning to emerge. Around noon, Ethan left for town. His daughter needed supplies for her science competition, and promises mattered more than mysteries. He parked his pickup truck outside a grocery store, picked up poster boards and markers, then stopped by the school hallway to drop them off. His daughter greeted him with a smile that made the long week worthwhile. Watching her excitement reminded him exactly why he had risked so much on the estate. Not for himself, for a future worth building. Later that afternoon, an unexpected convoy of black SUVs arrived at the property entrance. Ethan noticed them while repairing a damaged section of fencing. The vehicles carried the logo of Hayes Aeronautics. He set down his tools and waited. Charlotte Hayes stepped out first. She wore practical outdoor clothes instead of her usual executive attire, but confidence still followed her like a shadow. Several company specialists accompanied her. One of them immediately began photographing the aircraft. Another quietly laughed when he noticed Ethan's work clothes. So you're the guy who bought this place? Ethan nodded. Looks like you paid a lot for scrap metal. Ethan simply returned to tightening a fence post. The comment earned no reaction. Charlotte noticed that. Most people would have argued. He did not. One of her engineers approached an aircraft and began discussing restoration costs. Ethan listened for a few moments before politely pointing out a structural detail hidden beneath the wing assembly. The engineer dismissed him at first. Then he looked closer. His expression changed immediately. Ethan had been right. The flaw would have affected the entire assessment. Charlotte watched the exchange carefully. Not because Ethan embarrassed anyone. He did not. In fact, he quietly helped the engineer identify additional issues without drawing attention to himself. Later, while the group examined the hangar, a heavy storage rack began shifting unexpectedly. Before anyone else reacted, Ethan moved forward and stabilized it long enough for the workers nearby to move safely away. Then he calmly secured the structure using materials already on hand. No drama, no speeches, just competence. For the first time, Charlotte found herself studying him differently. The mechanic who supposedly made a foolish purchase kept noticing things trained professionals missed. As the afternoon ended, Charlotte thanked him for allowing the inspection. Ethan simply nodded and returned to his workbench. Then, one of the company's researchers called out from inside the hangar. Everyone turned. Hidden behind a false interior wall, partially concealed for decades, they had discovered a locked steel door that did not appear on any of the estate blueprints. Charlotte stared at it. Ethan stared at it. And suddenly the mystery surrounding the estate became much larger than either of them had imagined. The discovery of the hidden steel door spread through the small group faster than anyone expected. Within an hour, additional representatives from Hayes Aeronautics arrived at the estate carrying cameras, scanning equipment, and legal folders. What had begun as a curiosity was suddenly being treated like a serious historical find. Ethan Walker stood quietly near the hangar entrance, wiping dust from his hands after finishing repairs on a broken section of fencing. The excitement around him felt almost disconnected from the reality of his life. His pickup truck still needed new brakes. The utility bill on his kitchen counter was still overdue. His daughter still had a science competition coming up that required travel expenses he had not yet figured out how to cover. Yet somehow, everyone else's attention was focused on the door. A structural engineer hired by Hayes Aeronautics examined the wall surrounding it and immediately reached a conclusion. This section is unstable. Nobody should touch anything until a professional recovery team arrives. Several people nodded. Then the engineer glanced toward Ethan, especially not the property owner. The remark drew a few quiet smiles. Once again, the mechanic was being treated like the least qualified person in the room. Ethan offered no response. Instead, he walked to the main house and continued organizing maintenance records. Charlotte noticed. She had expected frustration, maybe even resentment. Instead, she saw the same calm discipline she had observed all afternoon. An hour later, one of the scanning devices produced inconsistent readings. The engineers debated possible explanations. Ethan listened from a distance while sorting papers on a table near a row of old mailboxes inside the house. Finally, he approached and politely pointed out that the wall might contain a secondary support chamber hidden behind the visible structure. The lead engineer dismissed the suggestion immediately. Based on what? Ethan held up a maintenance ledger. Based on these construction notes from 1974. The room grew quiet for a moment. Charlotte looked at the document. The engineer reluctantly reviewed it. Several minutes later, additional scans confirmed Ethan's assessment almost exactly. A hidden chamber did exist. The engineer's expression tightened. Charlotte said nothing, but something shifted in her perception. The mechanic was not guessing. He kept arriving at answers through knowledge, observation, and patience. As evening approached, dark clouds rolled across the countryside. Most of the team packed equipment before the incoming storm. Ethan remained behind to secure loose materials around the property. While others hurried to protect expensive scanning equipment, he quietly helped one contractor whose truck had become stuck in mud near the entrance road. The contractor had mocked him earlier. Ethan helped anyway. No lecture. No escorequeping. Just kindness. The rain began shortly after sunset. Water drummed against the hangar roof while the remaining team sheltered inside. Charlotte found Ethan reviewing ledgers under a portable lantern. You seem unusually interested in old maintenance records, she said. Ethan glanced up. People leave clues behind when they build something important. And you think something important is hidden here? He considered the question carefully. I think someone went to a lot of trouble to make sure it stayed hidden. Charlotte studied him. The answer sounded less like speculation and more like experience. Before she could ask another question, a loud metallic sound echoed from behind the concealed wall. Everyone turned. One of the support sections had shifted slightly under the pressure of the storm. A narrow opening, no wider than a few inches, appeared along the edge of the steel door. Through the gap, a beam of flashlight revealed something unexpected inside the chamber. Not gold, not cash, not valuables. Shelves, hundreds of carefully organized binders and storage boxes. And suddenly Ethan realized the greatest secret hidden on the estate might not be an object at all. It might be information. The storm passed during the night, leaving the estate wrapped in damp silence and morning fog. By sunrise, a specialized recovery crew hired by Hayes Aeronautics had carefully opened the concealed chamber behind the steel door. Ethan Walker arrived just after dropping his daughter at school. His pickup truck rolled slowly up the gravel drive, while workers unloaded equipment near the hangar. The discovery had already attracted attention throughout the county. Reporters were calling. Aviation historians were asking questions. Yet Ethan's first stop that morning had been the school hallway, where he made sure his daughter had lunch money and the signed paperwork she needed for her science competition. Some priorities never changed. Inside the chamber, hundreds of binders lined reinforced shelves from floor to ceiling. Technical drawings, engineering journals, aircraft development records, restoration notes. Charlotte Hayes stood beside a table reviewing documents with several specialists. The excitement was obvious. Then the mood changed. One researcher held up a faded blueprint and frowned. Critical pages were missing. Another discovered that large portions of the archive used technical notation few people recognized. Progress slowed immediately. The more documents they uncovered, the harder they became to understand. Ethan remained near the back of the room, quietly examining several binders that nobody else had selected. After nearly an hour, one of the engineers admitted defeat on a particularly confusing schematic. This coding system makes no sense. Ethan glanced at the page. Then he asked a simple question. Have you checked the restoration cross-references from the late 70s? The room went quiet. The engineer blinked. The what? Ethan reached for a nearby binder and opened it to a specific section almost instantly. Within minutes, he demonstrated how the entire filing system connected. One document referenced another. One set of aircraft modifications linked to separate maintenance logs stored elsewhere. Suddenly, information that had seemed random became organized. Several researchers exchanged surprised looks. Charlotte watched carefully. This was no lucky guess. Ethan understood the material deeply. More discoveries followed throughout the day. Hidden among the records were detailed restoration studies on rare aircraft components that had not been publicly documented for decades. Ethan recognized many of them immediately. He knew where to look. He knew how they worked. He knew why they mattered. Finally, Charlotte approached him directly. How do you know all of this? Ethan hesitated. The answer clearly made him uncomfortable. Years ago, before my daughter was born, I worked with a restoration group that specialized in historical aviation projects. Charlotte stared at him. The mechanic who supposedly bought a ruined estate on impulse had experience that perfectly matched the mystery hidden inside it. Then came the discovery that changed everything. One of the binders contained correspondence between the estate's original owner and a small team of engineers. The letters described an unfinished preservation project intended to protect historically significant aviation designs that otherwise would have been lost. Attached to the final letter was a list of names. Ethan read it once and froze. Charlotte noticed immediately. What is it? Ethan slowly handed her the page. Near the bottom was a familiar surname. Walker. Not his name specifically. His father's. The room seemed to shrink around him. For years, Ethan had believed his father had been little more than a mechanic who repaired farm equipment outside Fairview. Yet the documents suggested something very different. Something much larger. Charlotte looked from the letter to Ethan. The mystery was no longer only about the estate. Somehow, it had become personal, and hidden somewhere within the remaining records might be the answer neither of them had expected to find. For the first time since buying the estate, Ethan Walker drove home without thinking about engines, property repairs, or overdue bills. The name on the document would not leave his mind. His father's surname, buried inside correspondence connected to one of the most significant discoveries in the estate's history. The possibility felt unreal. That evening, his pickup truck rolled into the driveway just as his daughter finished practicing for her science competition at the kitchen table. School papers, colored markers, and half-finished project boards covered the room. Ethan smiled, helped her test a small model wind turbine, and listened as she excitedly described her presentation. He never mentioned the letter. Some burdens belonged to adults. Some moments belonged to children. The next morning, however, reality returned quickly. A certified notice waited in the mailbox. Property taxes associated with the estate were under review due to its newly discovered historical significance. Until ownership questions were resolved, portions of the property could face temporary restrictions. Ethan read the letter twice. Another complication. Another obstacle. Yet instead of reacting emotionally, he placed the notice inside a folder and headed to work. Responsibility first. Worry later. Back at the estate, researchers from Hayes Aeronautics continued cataloging documents from the hidden chamber. Progress accelerated whenever Ethan was nearby. He seemed able to identify connections buried across thousands of pages. References others missed stood out immediately to him. Serial numbers. Engineering revisions, restoration notes, historical timelines. Several specialists privately began relying on his observations before making conclusions. None could fully explain how a small-town mechanic kept outperforming people with advanced degrees. Charlotte noticed it too. What impressed her most was not his knowledge. It was what he did with it. Every time someone else made an important discovery, Ethan gave them credit. Every time a junior researcher asked a question, he stopped what he was doing to help. One afternoon, a nervous intern accidentally misplaced an archive box containing valuable documents. Panic spread through the team. Ethan quietly retraced the inventory process, located the error, and recovered the box within 20 minutes. He never embarrassed the young employee. He simply handed over the documents and returned to work. Charlotte watched the entire exchange. Respect was replacing curiosity now. Then came a breakthrough. Deep within a collection of engineering journals, Ethan uncovered references to a preservation project involving advanced aircraft restoration techniques decades ahead of their time. More importantly, several entries were signed using his father's initials. The room fell silent as historians reviewed the evidence. Ethan's father had not simply participated. He had been one of the project's key contributors. Yet none of the public records acknowledged him. The discovery raised more questions than answers. Why had his role disappeared? Why had he never spoken about it? Why had the entire project vanished from history? As evening approached, Charlotte and Ethan sat outside, the hangar reviewing copies of the journals. Beyond them, workers packed equipment while the setting sun reflected across the abandoned aircraft. "You seem remarkably calm about all of this," Charlotte said. Ethan looked toward the horizon. "My father spent 30 years fixing farm equipment. If he wanted recognition, he never showed it." Charlotte studied him carefully. The answer revealed more about Ethan than it did his father. Then her phone rang. Moments later, the color drained slightly from her face. A corporate legal team representing a powerful investment group had filed a challenge questioning ownership rights tied to portions of the estate's discoveries. If successful, the challenge could delay access to the archives indefinitely. Worse, it could threaten Ethan's ability to continue restoration work altogether. As darkness settled over the property, Ethan stared at the hangar where the answers to his family's past were finally emerging. For the first time, there was a real possibility that someone else might take that opportunity away before the truth could be uncovered. The legal challenge changed the atmosphere around the estate almost overnight. What had once felt like a restoration project now felt like a race against time. Researchers worked longer hours. Attorneys requested documents. Historians hurried to catalog evidence before access could potentially be restricted. Yet Ethan Walker's routine remained remarkably unchanged. The next morning, he still drove his daughter to school in his aging pickup truck. He still stopped at a small diner afterward for coffee before heading to the estate. He still carried a folded utility bill in his jacket pocket that he had not yet figured out how to pay. The discoveries might have attracted attention, but responsibility remained stubbornly ordinary. At the estate, Charlotte Hayes found Ethan alone inside the archive chamber before the rest of the team arrived. Hundreds of binders surrounded him. He was carefully cross-referencing engineering journals against restoration records using a system of handwritten notes spread across a folding table. Charlotte paused. "How long have you been here?" Ethan glanced at his watch. "Since 6. She looked around the room. Several researchers with advanced degrees had spent weeks trying to organize the archive. Somehow Ethan had mapped connections across dozens of document sets in only a few days. "You never told anyone how much experience you actually have." Ethan shrugged. Nobody asked. The answer lingered with her. Later that afternoon, another piece of the puzzle surfaced. Hidden inside a collection of correspondence between project engineers was a recommendation letter addressed to a prestigious aviation restoration institute. The candidate was Ethan Walker, not his father. Him. The date was nearly 20 years old. Attached were evaluations praising his unusual ability to diagnose complex systems, reconstruct historical engineering designs, and preserve technical records. The praise came from experts whose names were still respected in the field today. Charlotte read the documents twice. Suddenly, dozens of small mysteries made sense. The aircraft records, the serial numbers, the filing system, the engineering notes. Ethan had not stumbled into understanding them. He had spent years learning this work. Yet another question immediately emerged. Why was a man with credentials like these repairing transmissions in a small-town garage? The answer arrived later that evening. While reviewing additional correspondence, Charlotte uncovered another file. Medical records, family leave documents, letters explaining why Ethan had withdrawn from the institute program shortly after being accepted. His mother had become seriously ill. His father had already passed away. Someone needed to stay. Ethan had chosen family over opportunity. Again, the revelation changed the way several researchers viewed him, not simply because of what he knew, but because of what he had willingly given up. Yet Ethan himself seemed unaffected by the attention. When one of the younger archivists became overwhelmed by the growing workload, he quietly spent an hour helping her organize inventory records instead of focusing on his own research. By sunset, another breakthrough emerged. Deep within the remaining files, Ethan located evidence suggesting that portions of the preservation project had been intentionally hidden from corporate interests decades earlier. Not because they were valuable financially, because the engineers feared the work would be broken apart and lost. The discovery strengthened Ethan's legal position as owner of the estate. It also threatened powerful interests who wanted control over the archives. As darkness settled outside the hangar, Charlotte watched Ethan lock the archive room for the night. Respect had become admiration now, but admiration would not solve the growing problem, because the next morning, attorneys representing the investment group were scheduled to arrive with a formal injunction request. And if the judge granted it, Ethan could lose access to the very evidence that might finally reveal the truth about his father, his own past, and everything hidden inside the estate. The attorneys arrived just after 9 o'clock. Black sedans lined the gravel road leading to the estate while reporters gathered beyond the entrance gate hoping for updates. The atmosphere felt different now, less like a restoration project, more like a battle over who would control the story hidden inside the archives. Ethan Walker parked his pickup truck beside the hangar and watched the visitors unload briefcases instead of tools. He had spent the previous evening helping his daughter prepare for her science competition presentation. This morning he had dropped her off at school, smiled when she wished him luck, and promised he would be there afterward. It was a simple promise. Yet as the legal proceedings began, keeping it suddenly became uncertain. The investment group's attorneys moved aggressively. Their argument was straightforward. Because of the newly discovered historical significance of the archive, temporary control should be transferred to a preservation trust until ownership questions could be resolved. On paper, it sounded reasonable. In reality, it would remove Ethan from the project he had spent months protecting and unraveling. Worse, access to the remaining records could be restricted indefinitely. The archives did not simply contain technical information anymore. They contained pieces of his father's life, pieces of his own past. Charlotte Hayes listened carefully from across the conference table assembled inside the main house. More than once, she found herself glancing toward Ethan. He remained calm, respectful, focused, even when opposing counsel implied that a small-town mechanic lacked the expertise required to oversee a discovery of national importance. Even when they suggested his involvement had become a liability, Ethan never raised his voice. He simply answered questions honestly and let the facts speak for themselves. By noon, however, the situation worsened. The preliminary ruling granted temporary restrictions on large portions of the archive. Researchers would be supervised. Access would be limited. Several critical document collections were sealed pending further review. Ethan stood silently as boxes containing records connected to his father were marked for restricted access. That hurt more than he expected, not because of ownership, because after decades of unanswered questions, the truth was finally within reach. And now it was being taken away again. Outside, rain began falling across the estate. Ethan drove into town for his daughter's science competition, arriving just before presentation started. The school hallway buzzed with students carrying projects and display boards. For a little while, the legal battle faded into the background. His daughter smiled when she saw him. "You made it." Ethan nodded. "I told you I would." During her presentation, he stood quietly in the back of the room and applauded louder than anyone else. Yet even there, the pressure followed him. His phone vibrated repeatedly with messages from attorneys and researchers. He ignored everyone until the event ended. Family first. Always. Later that evening, another blow arrived. A review of estate finances revealed additional tax obligations tied to the property's new classification. Combined with legal costs and restoration expenses, the burden threatened everything Ethan had worked for. For the first time, there was a realistic possibility he could lose the estate altogether. Not because he had failed, not because he had been careless, but because powerful interests and complicated systems were closing around him faster than he could respond. As darkness settled over the property, Ethan sat alone inside the archive room, reviewing copies of the few documents still available to him. Rain tapped softly against the roof. The silence felt heavier than usual. Then he noticed something he had missed before. Hidden inside a routine inventory ledger was a reference to a sealed collection stored separately from the main archive. A collection never mentioned during the legal review. A collection identified by one familiar name, Walker. Ethan stared at the page. If the records were real, they might contain the evidence capable of changing everything. And somewhere within that final collection, the truth was waiting. The rain had stopped by morning, but the estate still felt heavy with uncertainty. Ethan Walker arrived before sunrise, carrying a thermos of coffee and a folder containing copies of every document he had personally cataloged over the previous weeks. His pickup truck sat alone near the hangar while fog drifted across the field where the abandoned airplanes rested. Most people would have focused on the legal fight. Ethan focused on the records. That had always been his way. When a system became complicated, he worked the problem one detail at a time. Inside the archive room, he returned to the inventory ledger that had revealed the existence of the separate Walker collection. The reference was subtle, buried between maintenance records and storage logs. Yet after hours of cross-referencing document codes, shelf locations, and construction diagrams, Ethan found something everyone else had missed. The sealed collection had never been stored inside the archive chamber at all. It had been relocated years earlier. The clue pointed toward a forgotten storage space beneath the original workshop attached to the estate's main house. By mid-morning, Charlotte Hayes, several historians, attorneys, and preservation officials gathered as workers carefully opened the concealed compartment. Dust covered everything. Wooden crates sat untouched for decades. Inside were journals, letters, project reports, photographs, and one final binder labeled simply, Legacy Preservation Initiative. Ethan opened it slowly. The first pages contained detailed records of the aviation project. The next pages explained why so much of the work had been hidden. But the final section changed everything. It contained signed statements from the project's founders, including Ethan's father. According to the documents, the preservation effort had survived because a small group of engineers and restoration specialists had voluntarily refused lucrative corporate offers that would have broken apart the archive. They chose preservation over profit, future generations over personal gain. One name appeared repeatedly throughout the records. Ethan's father. Then another name appeared in later years. Ethan Walker. Charlotte looked up in surprise. Ethan frowned. He had never seen these records before. Then he found the explanation. During his years working with historical restoration projects, Ethan had unknowingly continued contributing to the same preservation network his father helped create. The senior engineers who mentored him had been members of the original initiative. The knowledge he carried, the skills he developed, the values that guided him, they were part of the same legacy. Suddenly every piece fit together. The aircraft records, the filing systems, the restoration methods, even his instinct for preserving history instead of exploiting it. None of it was accidental. Hours later, the legal review meeting resumed inside the main house. Attorneys, historians, executives, reporters, and preservation officials filled the room. Evidence from a newly discovered collection was presented one document at a time. The records proved that Ethan had acted exactly as the original preservation team intended. He had protected the estate, preserved the archives, shared discoveries responsibly, and uncovered information nobody else had recognized. More importantly, the documents demonstrated that several claims made by the investment group directly contradicted the historical record. One by one, their arguments collapsed. Then came the moment nobody expected. A preservation official stood and read a passage from the founder's final statement. It described the qualities required to safeguard the archive: technical competence, integrity, humility, patience, and commitment to future generations over personal recognition. The official lowered the page and looked directly at Ethan. Mr. Walker has demonstrated every one of these qualities. The room went silent. Not because of money, not because of status, because everyone suddenly understood the truth. The mechanic they had underestimated from the beginning had been the most qualified steward of the estate all along. Charlotte felt a lump rise in her throat. She remembered the laughter at the auction, the dismissive comments, the assumptions, and she realized Ethan had never tried to prove anyone wrong. He had simply continued doing the right thing. The final ruling preserved his ownership rights, protected the archive, and established a partnership ensuring the collection would remain intact for future generations. The victory was earned entirely through his knowledge, his persistence, and his character. A week later, Ethan stood outside the estate with his daughter. Volunteers from the community helped clean portions of the property. Historians cataloged documents. Restoration work continued. His daughter pointed toward one of the airplanes and smiled. So all of this happened because you bought a place everyone else thought was junk? Ethan laughed softly. Not exactly. She tilted her head. Then why? Ethan looked across the property toward the hangar, the archives, and the people working together. Then he glanced at his old pickup truck parked beside the road. Because sometimes the most valuable things are the ones people stop looking at. His daughter nodded, as if that answer made perfect sense. Maybe it did. Across the field, Charlotte watched the scene unfold. The respect she felt had long since become something deeper. Admiration for a man whose strength came not from power, but from responsibility. Not from recognition, but from integrity. The estate had given Ethan answers about his father, but it had given everyone else something too. A reminder that dignity does not need an audience. Character does not need a title. And sometimes the people the world overlooks are the very people holding its most important treasures.